by the American Conservative Union, the leading organization of conservative elected officials and activists and citizens in Washington, D.C., and is co-sponsored by two Dallas groups, the National Center for Policy Analysis and my organization, the Institute for Policy Innovation. We appreciate ACU allowing us to co-sponsor this important event. I have to say, one of the things I'm most excited about today is learning that ACU is prioritizing innovation policy. There's not enough of the policy groups in Washington and around the country that make innovation policy a priority. I don't know how many of you realize this or not, but we're no longer the place the world buys cheap stuff. We are not the low-cost manufacturer. We are not the source of cheap agricultural products. I come from South Carolina, used to be the world's leading textiles manufacturing area. There are no more textiles in the Carolinas. That's not who we are anymore. We're the people who invent things and create things and design things. We are the innovators in the world economy. In fact, the Commerce Department has identified a subset of U.S. industries that it calls the IP-intensive industries, IP as in intellectual property. And it turns out that in any given year, somewhere around 60% of our total exports are in those IP-intensive industries. 60% of what the world buys from us are the products of intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademark, and some things covered by trade secrets. So if we're going to have a dynamic and globally competitive American economy, it's going to be based on innovation. It's going to be based on invention and creation and design. So that's who we are. Some people have referred to IP industries as a narrow slice of industries. These may have one time been a narrow slice of industries, but no longer. This is what the world wants from us. And so the protection of innovation, the protection of intellectual property, that core property right that tells an inventor or a creator, if my product succeeds, if my idea works, I at least have the opportunity to benefit from it, to draw a stream of income from it, and to control what happens to it. That's core and that's fundamental to the innovation economy. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. We have a very noteworthy panel today. ACU should be commended for bringing all these folks together and bringing them down to Dallas. And we're going to go in, down here in Texas, we like to do ladies first. We're gentlemen here in Texas, and that's normally how we do things. But we decided to go in a more logical order today. So our first speaker is going to be Scott Keefe. And Scott is the Commissioner of the United States International Trade Commission. He's a bureaucrat, even though he's a conservative. If we're going to have bureaucrats, we might as well have some good conservative ones. And we've got two of them here with us today. So Scott Keefe is a commissioner of the U.S. International Trade Commission. He was formerly a law professor at George Washington University, where he was Fred C. Stevenson Research Professor. And he was once affiliated with Stanford University's Hoover Institution, which many of you probably recognize. I think you resigned that affiliation when you went to work for the U.S. government. Scott has spoken at IPI events before. He's a great speaker, does a great job of sort of relating the importance of innovation and intellectual property to folks who don't spend all day studying these things. So let's hear first from Scott, and then when Scott's finished, I'll introduce Maureen Olshausen. Scott?
Well,
and let's have you speak from here so that everyone can see you.
okay, I will gladly do that, and I want to thank you for the kind remarks. I feel like I'm at an AA meeting and need to start by saying a confession. I do work for the government. Of course, while I work for the government, I can only offer my own ideas, and so I speak only for myself and not for the government and not for my colleagues in the government. It's especially nice to be here today. It's a federal holiday. That means I'm not skipping work. But it's an important holiday. It's Veterans Day, and we should really thank our veterans for their service and recognize them on today. Intellectual property is a fairly bookish topic, and if you think about all the debates about healthcare, intellectual property probably features most prominently as the cure for that serious disease we sometimes have, which is insomnia. And we can often put an audience to sleep if you talk about a bookish topic like intellectual property. But it turns out patents really are not that complicated. And patents can be immensely helpful to an economy in a way that is directly helpful to the people as they do their business, and it's also indirectly helpful as that group of people, that country, that society tries to stand safely, securely in a very competitive world and in a world where the security threats are quite real. So patents turn out to be important to our economy and to our security. Now, many people talk about patents, and the first image they have in their mind is this notion that inventors are out there like hungry little rabbits, and if the government would just dangle in front of them a dollar, a carrot, or a patent, they will scurry towards the dollar, the carrot, or the patent like greedy, hungry little bunnies, gobble it up, and in so doing somehow help society. Yes, it is true that patents are helpful things, and it is true that patents can be very important in helping inventors. But it turns out the property rights story that Tom alluded to is a story that we all, as market-oriented people, can relate to as being essential not because patents are like carrots in front of little bunnies, but rather because patents can be something very, very different. Think about it this way. Most of us work with other people. Inventors need venture capitalists. They need manufacturers. They need marketers. They need laborers, skilled and unskilled. And all of those people must come together and do a dance with each other in order for new products and services to come to market, in order for new business models to be developed. Well, here's the deal. If you turn out the lights in this room and close the blinds and make it pitch black, and one of you lights a match, turns on a flashlight, what do all the rest of us know? Exactly where that person is. And like a beacon in a dark room, a patent, when it is enforced like a property right, can draw to itself all of the other complementary users of that asset who are interested in it. So when you light your match or turn on your flashlight and the rest of us come to talk to you, who will we find? Well, not only you, but the rest of us who are interested in you. Patents can be like beacons in a dark room, drawing to themselves all the many different users of the asset to transact with each other, to negotiate. And that's something that government can't do very well. Yes, government can give tax credits. Yes, government can give rewards. Governments can get together and issue prizes and other things. But patents are different. Patents are not like that carrot. Patents are so much more. Patents are like the beacon in the dark room. Patents coordinate you in the marketplace to interact with each other. And patents are at their best when they do that. Now, that's not a story that says that we need more patents or fewer patents, and many of the debates today are not really about that. They're about the detailed differences between very bookish legal regimes about how you think about patents. But a lot of it just boils down to this. Imagine an objective fact. The street light was green when you crossed the street, or it was red when you crossed the street. Imagine an objective fact. My laboratory notebook says something, or it doesn't, and the date is before yours or not. Those are objective facts. When patent law turns on objective facts, patent law is at its best to serve this beacon-like role. But when patent law turns on the subjective discretion of government officials to say, gosh, I like you, your patent's good, and I don't like you so much, and your patent's not so good. When government officials have the flexible discretion to decide to pick and choose winners and losers, patents no longer operate very well like beacons in a dark room. And instead, patents become tools for the government to draw you to the government and to, in fact, decrease competition by allowing you to talk with the government to suppress competition. So the debates about patents today really boil down to, are we going to have a patent system that gets new businesses brought to market, that makes patents stand like beacons in dark rooms, that get deals done, that bring new business models to market? If so, here's what can happen. David has a shot against Goliath. Patents can be like the vital slingshot that the Davids have in the marketplace against Goliaths, that they can compete against established industries. That's a wonderful thing. It helps consumers get access to new stuff, new goods, new services. But it also makes our marketplace vibrant and competitive. And it ensures that new and exciting business models are growing here at home in America. We're not against new and exciting business models growing overseas. We think that's great as well. Good is good for everyone. But if new and exciting business models are only growing overseas and not also growing at home, then we have not only an economic hit, but we have a security hit. And the security hit is that as those new and vibrant business models grow only overseas, other parts of the world get to learn a whole lot about how we do our community organizing, how we do our watching of TV, how we purchase things with our credit cards. We're in effect giving them all free intel. And there's no particular reason to think they're going to use it nicely in our interests. New business models are great for the economy. New business models strengthen our markets. New business models improve our security. Patents can be a big part of that story. Of course, one size never fits all, and patents have their limitations, and we should talk about how to make them best. We look forward to more of your questions about how to do that. But this is an introduction. Let's hand it over to our next speaker.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. You know, Scott mentioned national security, and Scott, I would just bet there's more espionage going on right now to find out what American companies are innovating than there is to find out what the U.S. government is planning. You know, I mean it's just a huge amount of corporate espionage going on right now to try to get a head start or to try to steal our own ideas. So there's definitely a national security angle to this. I failed to acknowledge some important folks in the crowd when I was making my introductory comments, so let me address that now. We have several elected officials with us today. We're very pleased that you're with us. Representative Angie Chen Button is here somewhere. Representative, glad you could be here. Representative Cindy Burkett is here somewhere. There's Cindy. Hello. There you go. Thank you so much. And Van Taylor, who is going to the Texas Senate, is here today. Thank you so much. We're really honored that as busy as you folks are post-election that you decided to be with us here today. We appreciate that. Another wonderful conservative free market bureaucrat who's with us today is Maureen Olhausen, who is a commissioner with the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the FTC, she was a partner at Wilkinson, Barker, and Nauer, where she focused on FTC issues, including competition law, privacy, and technology policy. The FTC has a broad purview in our economy for under the banner of protecting consumers, but there's an awful lot of stuff that ends up falling under that banner as well. And more the FTC is becoming not only a regulator of many of those practices, but also a a researcher and an issuer of studies and reports on our economy and on our innovation economy as well. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Olhausen.
Thanks, Tom, and in my defense, I'd like to say, if we cede the field in the bureaucracy, then we're going to end up with the bureaucracy that we deserve. Right. So we need to have conservative voices in the bureaucracy kind of fighting from the inside, so in my defense. So, but thanks to Dan Schneider and the American Conservative Union for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with you today and just to discuss the importance of intellectual property to our economy and to the FTC's role in protecting intellectual property rights as part of its mission to promote competition and consumer welfare across the U.S. economy. I should also mention, though, that I am only speaking for myself. My views do not necessarily represent the views of my fellow commissioners, and sometimes I will tell you they really don't represent their views. But I've often said that protecting the right to a person's intellectual property is a cornerstone of our national success. I think Scott did a great job in explaining this in his remarks, and I'll just build upon those a bit. The founders recognized the importance of it, and so has the U.S. Supreme Court. And I agree with the court that intellectual property rights are needed as, quote, an incentive to inventors to risk the often enormous costs in terms of time, research, and development. The productive efforts thereby fostered will have a positive effect on society through the introduction of new products and processes into manufacture in the economy. And as Scott pointed out, the sharing of that information, when you file a patent, then that information is shared more widely of what you're claiming. If you don't have a patent, what you end up with is trade secret law, and there's no obligation to later on share your trade secrets. But as a commissioner, I believe in my agency's mission. But as one of the 2 conservative commissioners out of a total of 5, one of my main jobs in the last few years has been to remind the majority of how important IP rights are in our country and the need for my agency to tread carefully in the pursuit of its mission. Overall, I think the message is connecting, but I've been surprised at how quickly some people are willing to trade away the long-term benefits that come from protecting IP rights for the short-term gains that can come from discounting them. And at times I've had to dissent. Generally, I think my agency is doing a pretty good job about being thoughtful and trying to balance its mission and protecting IP rights. We're very active in a lot of issues touching on intellectual property rights. And as Tom mentioned, we do research. We're primarily an enforcement agency, and I actually do a lot of interaction on the international front, including in Asia. I did want to spend a couple minutes discussing an issue that the FTC has been focusing on a lot recently, and that may be of interest to you, which is whether patent assertion entities, also known as PAEs, or sometimes known as patent trolls, are hurting competition, innovation, and the economy. As a commissioner, I spend a lot of time meeting with people around the U.S. and abroad and speaking at events like these. And sometimes it's about other areas of the FTC's enforcement work, advertising, privacy, what have you. But more and more people have been approaching me about intellectual property rights and asking me what the FTC is going to do on those practices. Well, first of all, this just tells me how important intellectual property has become to sustaining our modern and creative economy. And it also tells me that people are worried, and they're worried that we aren't doing enough at the FTC to figure out what type of patent assertion conduct is good and what can be bad. So, for example, I've spoken to the the Retail Federation of America about privacy and advertising issues, but a lot of people there were raising concerns about patent assertion behavior. I spoke to groups in the advertising area, and the same issues came up. They were saying, we're worried about patent assertion entities affecting the ability of small startups to prosper and grow. And so from these discussions, I got an understanding of the urgency and anxiety that many people are feeling about patent assertion conduct. But this goes to my earlier point about the importance of IP rights, because I also frequently hear from people on the other side about, well, what's going on? Has there been an increase in patent litigation over the past few years? What's causing it? And we hear basically 2 narratives. One is that there have been too many bad patents put out, that protecting patent rights, protecting IP rights is a drag on the economy. But then some other people have said, well, look, there have been enormous technological innovations. A lot of these products involve standards that have many, many patents as part of them, and that what we're experiencing now is really no different than what we've seen in other areas of rapid technological innovation. And so we have to figure out what's the best approach here. How do we balance these two conflicting narratives? So while a lot of people have called for immediate action against all PAEs, last year I counseled caution, because I think we need to be careful before we tinker with something as fundamental as IP rights and the right to go to court and enforce those patent rights. We also all probably agree that as the world economy becomes more interconnected, we want emerging economies like China and India to see the U.S. continuing to protect its IP rights for a variety of reasons. And I'll tell you, I've been to Asia many times as a commissioner. I've been to China 5 times. I was just in Korea a few weeks ago. Scott was there as well. And I can tell you they are watching us very, very closely. And they're taking notes on the favorite parts of our laws or laws that are being proposed or decisions that agencies like mine are handing down. And I think we need to be really, really careful to avoid giving cover to anyone outside the U.S. to chip away at our intellectual property rights and to make it easier for foreign companies to use them without paying appropriate licensing fees. And I've personally heard presentations in these foreign countries that make the case for adopting sort of contentious or not very well supported U.S. legal doctrines as a way to justify opening IP for wider and presumably easier and definitely cheaper licensing. And these proposals are making their way into China's proposed rules governing IP licensing. One of the things that the FTC is doing in this area is to delve in a little bit more deeply and to get a much better understanding of what's really going on with patent assertion entities. How do we know who's got the patents? Are they asserting them in a way that's different from companies that actually manufacture? Where does the money go to? How does their behavior compare with others? And so the FTC has undertaken a study in this area. It's fairly comprehensive, and it'll take us about a year to finish up our work. But I always think that it's important, before we make a fundamental change to a system that's worked fairly well, that we have a good empirical basis for understanding, are there problems? What's the best way to address those problems? Are they problems about patent quality? Are they antitrust problems? Or are there some other issue at hand? And then finally, I wanted to mention one other thing that the FTC can do now, and it has recently done. So one of the concerns that I've often heard raised about patent trolls is the idea that they're sending lots of abusive demand letters to small businesses, mom and pop stores, the small advertising shops that I mentioned. And so at the FTC, we took a look at that and we did an investigation. And just last week, we alleged that a company that had gone out and bought some patents relating to network scanners and then contacted several thousand businesses with a letter saying, you're infringing these and you need to pay a license immediately, and everyone else in the industry has paid this license. And those things turned out not to be true. And so we alleged that these were deceptive or unsubstantiated claims and violated Section 5 of the FTC Act. Now, you may recognize some of these allegations as similar to the kinds of suits we've brought against debt collectors for abusive practices. And basically, that's because they are. They're basically garden variety frauds or consumer abuse that was trying to hide behind the IP laws. I think, therefore, it was a good place for the FTC to start. I think it was a good place for us to draw the line. And as one can say, it was an easy case. We actually got all 5 commissioners to support it. But it was one that allowed us to protect consumers and small businesses while not infringing on legitimate IP rights. So I hope that gives you just a very brief idea of where the FTC fits into the debate on intellectual property and PAEs, and why we need to strive to be measured and focused in handling these issues. So at this point, I'll hand it back to the other panelists, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
You know, it strikes me that there may be some people here who don't actually follow intellectual property day to day. In fact, probably most of you don't. And so you may not realize just how controversial intellectual property policy has become in recent years. Both Scott and Maureen alluded to this. Our primary foreign policy problem right now with India is about intellectual property. One of the most controversial pieces of legislation that was before the Congress in this past session was about intellectual property, patent reform. We have several trade agreements right now we are negotiating. We have a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that we're negotiating. We have an agreement with the EU that we're negotiating. The most controversial sections of those trade agreements are about intellectual property. We have activist organizations and think tanks like IPI and ACU and NCPA on the other side of this issue who will put out papers saying patents kill people. Literally, patents kill people. Why? Well, because patents are the reason that drug prices are high. The reason that cancer drug is so expensive is because of the patent. And so somehow if we could magically get rid of patents, suddenly we would have all these abundant, wonderful things for next to almost nothing. So intellectual property really has been an extremely controversial topic, both domestically in the US and also internationally. And so again, that's why I'm so excited that ACU is jumping in with both feet on this issue, because this is a crucial issue for conservatives and for free market folks who want to make sure that the US economy remains globally competitive. There's nothing more important than for us to make sure that our property rights-based system of innovation is not eroded, either purposely or by neglect. Which brings us to our third speaker. Carly Fiorina is one of the most accomplished people you will ever meet, male or female. The list of achievements that she has made in her life is truly remarkable. And Carly, I love the thing in your bio about how you joined AT&T as an entry-level sales position. I just think that's so interesting that you worked your way up in the company. Carly was CEO, best known as CEO of Hewlett-Packard for 6 years. While Carly was CEO of Hewlett-Packard, she tripled the rate of measurable innovation at HP to 11 patents a day, which is remarkable. Doubled the company's revenues to $90 billion and quadrupled the growth rate of the company to 9%. I mean, that's just fascinating over a 6-year period. And if that wasn't enough, she ran for Senate in California against Barbara Boxer, a thankless but very important task to which we all appreciate you doing. And today, Carly is chairman of the American Conservative Union Foundation. So this is one of those wonderful situations where an accomplished and skilled leader and manager decides to devote their time to issues and to policies that matter. May more of your CEO tribe follow your lead in doing that. Please join me in welcoming Carly Fiorina.
Well, thank you so much and good afternoon. And I want to begin by thanking the National Center for Policy Analysis and the Institute for Policy Innovation for co-hosting this event with us. There is a reason that we have gathered you here today at this time. It's not just because this is a fascinating subject. It's not just because it's a controversial subject. It's because our lawmakers in Washington, D.C. are, as we speak, contemplating actions that we think will have a real impact on intellectual property. And I'll get to that in a moment. But before I do that, I also want to take just a moment and recognize that today is Veterans Day. And could I ask all of the veterans who are in the room to stand, please? Thank you for your service, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your service, and we're honored as well by the attendance here of representatives and new senator-elect. I want to begin in a slightly different place. Intellectual property is an important subject. It sometimes can be a highly complicated subject, although I think the two previous speakers have done a wonderful job of explaining its impact on our nation as well as on our security. But I want to bring it down to human terms because it is human terms that have caused me to get engaged and stay engaged in politics, whether it's as a candidate or as an advisor to other candidates or as someone who's interested in policy. You see, what politicians do, whether it's here in Texas or in Washington, D.C., impacts people's lives in very real ways. And while intellectual property sounds like a highly theoretical thing, what we do on intellectual property also impacts people's lives in very real ways. So I'm going to start with my own story, not because I'm so important, but because I think my story is illustrative of how our economy works. It is true that I started at an entry-level sales position in AT&T, but prior to that, I was a medieval history and philosophy major.
Is that why you started?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, on the nose. In fact, graduating with that degree from Stanford University, all dressed up, nowhere to go, I went off to law school, hated it, quit after a single semester, and had to earn a living. And so I went back to work doing full-time what I had done part-time to help put myself through Stanford. That is, I became a secretary full-time. I typed and filed and answered the phones part-time when I was a college student, and I was hired as a full-time secretary by a little 9-person firm. And after about 6 months, the 2 founders of that 9-person firm came to my desk and said, you know, we think you could do more than type and file. Do you want to know what we do? Do you want to know something about business? And so that first job in that little 9-person firm changed the course of my life. Now, why do I tell you that? Because the truth is that most Americans get their start in little companies. I ran a huge company, Hewlett-Packard, but people forget that Hewlett-Packard was started by 2 guys in a garage. And the truth is that little companies that are run by entrepreneurs create 2/3 of the new jobs in this country, and they employ half the people. And so when little companies don't do well, when entrepreneurs don't thrive, when the small innovator, like Bill Hewlett or Dave Packard or Thomas Edison, when the small innovator doesn't have a chance, our whole economy suffers. It's not just that small businesses and entrepreneurs and individual innovators are the growth engine of our economy, although they clearly are. You know, if we want to create jobs, we have to grow the economy. If we want to grow the economy, we have to have innovation. And innovation comes about because people choose to take risks, and people choose to take risks because they expect a reward. Small businesses, individual entrepreneurs also innovate at 7 times the rate of big businesses. So while I was very proud as the chief executive of Hewlett-Packard to say that we were generating 11 patents a day, the truth is it's the little guys who innovate at 7 times that rate. So innovators, entrepreneurs, small businesses are the growth and innovation engine of our economy. They have always been, and they will always be. Because big companies, like big government agencies, become kind of bureaucratic. And it's hard to innovate in a big bureaucratic structure. That's just the way it is. We all know that. This is why, for example, the Chinese work so hard to steal our intellectual property, and having done business in China for many, many years, rest assured, they steal our intellectual property. The reason they do so is because they don't have the kind of economy that we do, that embraces and supports an individual entrepreneurial spirit, and so they have less innovation and less intellectual property as a result. What's happening today in our economy is that the little guy, the small business, the individual entrepreneur and innovator is getting crushed. I use that harsh term because the stats bear out that harsh term. Today, fewer small businesses are starting and more are failing than at any time in over 40 years. Today, for the first time in U.S. history, we are destroying more businesses than we are creating. And if you ask small business owners or entrepreneurs or individual owners why they're giving up, why they're selling out, why they're not moving forward with their business, what they're going to tell you is, it's just too hard. Or what they also might tell you is, you know, the risks have gotten so much higher and the rewards have gotten so much lower. And why is that? Because we have a regulatory thicket that has been building in Washington, D.C. for decades. And while a very big company like Hewlett-Packard can deal with complex legislation and regulation, a little company cannot. I may not have liked a lot of legislation and regulation in Washington, D.C. as a chief executive of a $90 billion company, but I could deal with it. I could hire accountants. I could hire lawyers. I could hire lobbyists. The little guys can't. So they get crushed by that regulatory thicket and that burden. They get crushed by a tax code that's overly complex, and they can't figure out a way to get through it. And they're also getting crushed, I think, by this reality. Big government and big business do well together. But big government is bad for little businesses. A big business can handle virtually everything that comes its way. A little business can't. And now into this reality, this political and economic reality, that entrepreneurialism is under assault in our country, that small businesses are struggling in our nation, that big business and big government do just fine working together, and that frequently, candidly, as we know, big business uses big government to enhance its competitive position. It's called crony capitalism. Now into this mix comes an attempt to rewrite our intellectual property laws and patent protection. And it's called, as many of these pieces of legislation frequently are, they have great names associated with them. This particular piece of legislation is called the Innovation Act. Who could be against that? Of course, we want innovation. It's the Innovation Act. Now, before I talk to you a little bit about the Innovation Act, just remember this. Intellectual property is a fancy word for saying that if I create something, build something by my own blood, sweat, and tears, or the virtue of my creativity and brilliance, then I own it. I own it. And that fundamental notion is at the core of our Constitution. It is at the core of our economy. I have described the 21st century as the century of brain power. Because whereas at the time our Constitution was written, in the 19th and the 20th century, physical property was incredibly important. Physical assets were very important, and they still are, no question. But what's the most important asset in the 21st century? Brain power. Brain power. The country with the best brain power wins. And brain power's output is intellectual property. And so it is vital, if we're going to prosper in the 21st century, that we think about the output of brain power as an important an asset as we possess. So, Innovation Act sounds great. The Innovation Act is a broad, sweeping piece of legislation that purports to solve the problem of patent trolls. Patent trolls, people who go out and assert patents in order to stop commerce, in brief. It is backed by some very big companies. Google, for example. And we all understand why Google might think this was a good idea, to make it easier for them to acquire patents of others. I want to draw you back to an analogy for a moment before I end my comments and allow us to get into the Q&A. Remember Dodd-Frank? Remember Dodd-Frank? Dodd-Frank was a broad, sweeping piece of legislation accompanied by tens of thousands of pieces of regulation, and it was designed to solve a real problem. It was a real problem. The financial system was was melting down. Consumers needed protection. It was a real problem, and we laid out this sweeping, not we, but others, our politicians, got a sweeping bill passed. And guess what happened? What's the result of that sweeping piece of legislation? 10 banks too big to fail became 5 banks too big to fail with record bonuses all around. And meanwhile, the community banking system is on its back because the community banks are too small to be able to handle it. And the problem is the community banking system is where Main Street entrepreneurs go and get loans. It's where family businesses get their loans. It's where an individual family gets a line of credit. Community banks, the community banking system is the backbone of Main Street entrepreneurship. So this sweeping piece of legislation that was designed to solve a problem has created more crony capitalism and less Main Street entrepreneurialism. Now let's think about the Affordable Care Act. Who could be against affordable care? Right? We had a problem. We had a problem. Some people weren't getting health care. Some people didn't have health insurance. Real problem. But once again, we took a sweeping approach to that. A piece of legislation was passed that is longer than a Harry Potter novel. Literally. Literally. It has been accompanied by tens upon tens of thousands of pieces of regulation. And what is the outcome of that? Everybody has a problem. Everybody has a problem. And we've made a situation worse, and we haven't solved the original problem. It is in that context that I think about the Innovation Act, a large, sweeping piece of legislation backed by big companies that has a real problem over here that they claim they're solving. Frankly, I have come to the point of view in my life, having managed big bureaucracies, I do not ever trust a large bureaucracy pushed around by political interests, by people who do not have the time to understand the intricacies of what they're passing, to do something better than the free market can work it out, or that states as laboratories of democracy can work it out. But what we know is that a guy like Thomas Edison, under the Innovation Act, might be in real trouble. So that's why we've gathered you here, because Dodd-Frank has done real damage to our financial system, in my opinion. Obamacare has done real damage to our healthcare system. And I think that the Innovation Act, which has bipartisan support right now, because hey, who could fight against Silicon Valley, and Google's a big tech company. I think the Innovation Act is the next assault on Main Street entrepreneurialism, innovation, the little guy versus the big guy. And one more thing, and then I'll stop. There is a solution to the real problem. It's a very targeted piece of legislation. It's called the Troll Act. It came out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. We could solve a particular problem. But if we boil the ocean in a political way, we're going to create a lot of unforeseen consequences in an economy where our individual entrepreneurs and small business owners are already having too difficult a time. And that is why our economy is growing at a subpar level, because small businesses and entrepreneurs aren't thriving. Thanks very much, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Carly, thank you for putting that in a broad context, because of course there are other pieces to the innovation system, right? There is the tax piece. I mean, not only does the innovator have to have the security that if his innovation succeeds, he can own it, but he would also like to have the security of knowing that he can profit from it and won't have to give 60% of his money back to the tax authorities, right? And you touched on regulation. There's also a regulatory piece to the innovation system. You have to have streamlined, reasonable regulations and not voluminous regulations that you don't find out what's in the bill until a year after it's passed. But then thanks also for boiling this down to some specific legislation. It may be shorthand for folks. The Troll Act came out of the Republican House. The Innovation Act came out of Harry Reid's Senate. So that may be all the shorthand you need for sort of guessing which of those is superior, which of those is inferior. What I'd like to do now for a couple minutes is give our two, I keep saying bureaucrats, I hope I'm not offending you, give our two free market conservative federal regulators, right, federal public servants, a chance maybe to respond to what Carly said and to what the other has said. So we'll have a little discussion among our panel, and then we will leave time for Q&A and discussion with the audience. So Maureen or Scott, did you have
Great.
anything you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think, Carly, you raised some great points about the difficulty of a small business, a small inventor, to stand up against the big tech company. And it reminds me, if you saw, there's this idea of catch me if you can, right? So I invented, a great thing, I got it patented, and a big company says, gee, I like that. I'm going to take that and I'm going to use it. Little guy, good luck trying to track me down and fight off, my lawyers. And some of the things that these legislative proposals are doing is making it even harder for the small inventor to get the reward for his or her work. So I think that really is problematic. And so much of this is put into the narrative of, oh, the patent holders are oppressing small business through these false demand letters that I talked about. And I think the Troll Act, I agree, that is a very targeted, focused way to get at that, which may be a real problem, but it's a small problem, and what's being proposed outside of the Troll Act is a very, very large solution that doesn't do much for that small problem and brings on a whole lot of other baggage that I think is a baggage that will be weighing down small business.
I guess the only thing I would add to the just exceptional remarks that both of my colleagues have made, truly stunning experience for me to listen to them. I couldn't have enjoyed it more. So all I could do to add is a set of questions. If the problem with patents is that patent litigation takes too long, then maybe we ought to like a place that does patent litigation quickly. Say, typical district court patent case is 5 to 7 years. What if you could do it in 18 months? If the concern is that patent litigation is too uncertain and no experts get to engage, a lay jury decides in patent cases, then we ought to be enthusiastic about a patent adjudication venue full of technically trained scientists, engineers, and industry experts, full of economists and full of lawyers and judges and other government officials trained in patent law. If the concern is that patents are too subject to politics, then you ought to like a government agency that's politically independent, that has 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, a chair that is required to rotate person and party every 2 years and therefore has to be independent. If the concern about patents is that the cost of such a bureaucracy could grow into the billions of dollars, then you ought to be pretty excited about an $80 million agency. So it turns out we've got one of those. The Patent Office is $3.5 billion, and the only thing it does to address the problem of patents these days is tie them up in long procedural re-examinations. We've got another one of those agencies. I happen to work there, the International Trade Commission. Our budget is $80 million. We have 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. We get along very well. Our chair rotates every 2 years. We're quite independent of both political parties and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. And we decide our patent cases in 18 months. Patentees win at our agency. Patentees lose at our agency. Win-loss rates happen to be split. We find patents to be infringed. We find patents to be invalid. We go both ways. And we happen to have a great affirmance rate at the appellate court. So sounds like that's the agency we ought to eliminate from the patent system, and that's exactly what many of the proposals recommend. So I do work in this agency, and look, I'm perfectly supportive of a view if you want to get rid of the agency and you have a good reason to do it. Let's get rid of the agency if it's a bad thing. But if the things you're worried about are the things we just talked about, then that points in the other direction. That doesn't add up at all. So I'm not here to make a case about any particular piece of legislation or about any particular part of government. But I am here to notice that the logic doesn't work.
We should acknowledge, I think, that there is a problem when a restaurant is getting a patent demand letter, right?
Right.
And so people are in the business of complying with the health department code and making their customers happy, and all of a sudden they're getting scary patent demand letters that are simply designed to extort money out of them so that they'll settle. So I don't want us to, because we're all generally of a pro-IP bent, I don't want us to dismiss the fact that that's a problem. But it has always seemed to me that that's not a problem with the patent system, that's a problem with the legal system.
Well, and as Maureen pointed out, there are a number of legal tools on the books today that her agency, my agency, and other agencies and courts are quite adept at using. So, again, if that's the concern, then those tools are the solutions, and we could absolutely be logical in considering similar solutions, but they would not be the whole cloth reimagination
Right.
that Carly was pointing out.
And as Maureen mentioned, the FTC is taking action on the demand
Right.
letter.
We just sued and settled with one of the most aggressive entities, a real, its business model was just to assert these patents without any real, basis for the assertion. And the letters were deceptive, and we sued them under our traditional, authority that we've had for almost 100 years. And I do think we have the tools. I mean, it's been interesting, as I've gone around mentioning that in the debates, people kind of say, like, be quiet, Don't talk about the fact that it's a narrow problem and you probably already have the tool in your hand to do it, and maybe we could improve that tool a little bit, because they want to do all this other stuff, but under the cover of fixing the small problems.
Right.
So, I mean, we've seen this movie before a few times. That is my, sorry. We've seen this movie before. Oh my gosh, there's a problem. Oh, it's a huge problem. Oh, the only way to solve the problem is to get together with the big players in the industry affected by the problem, the banks, the healthcare providers, the big technology companies, and reimagine the whole system. We've seen this movie before.
Or in the infamous phrase, never let a crisis go to waste, right?
And oh, by the way, put a great title on it, so it sounds good.
Right, exactly. But the Troll Act, which you mentioned favorably, the Troll Act, again, seems to be a discrete, targeted approach to solving the real core problem. If you're not at all familiar with this, it's the ambulance chasing lawyer, essentially, in the IP world. And they might go out and license some patents that they think might be lucrative, and then they just start showering the country with these demand letters. And if you don't pay us $10,000 or $20,000 to license this patent, we'll sue you. Well, you can imagine what happens to the small group of app developers, two guys, sitting in a garage somewhere writing an app, and all of a sudden they start getting these demand letters. Now, maybe they are infringing the patent. Okay, we have to acknowledge the fact that, if you are in fact infringing a patent, you should not be permitted to do so. But you have discovery and you have courts that determine that. That shouldn't be decided just by someone sending out a big tranche of demand letters. So it is a problem, but again, it's a problem that can be solved discreetly in a targeted way by legislation that addresses the legal abuses going on, rather than essentially hijacking the issue to turn it into a patent reform discussion that has sometimes not much to do with the actual problem that you're trying to address.
Exactly right. And I think, look, as conservatives, we favor targeted solutions and limited government for a reason. It works better. But I think if you combine this conversation with an announcement that the White House made yesterday pushing hard on net neutrality, what you're basically seeing is big government trying to pick the winners and the losers in this new information-based economy through net neutrality, through the Innovation Act, through other mechanisms. And when big government picks winners and losers, the big guys always win and the small guys always lose. It is the way of the world. And unfortunately, the small guys are the backbone of the economy and the backbone of innovation in this nation.
Net neutrality is actually a really good example, isn't it? It's a really good illustration
Right.
because, again, something that could be dealt with existing authorities. I mean, you know, if a ISP is out there abusing its customers, or if an ISP is out there asserting essentially antitrust violating behaviors, we already have several federal agencies that are tasked with doing that, right?
Yes, I actually headed up the FTC's Internet Access Task Force in the Bush administration, and we issued a report in 2007 that talked about this, and it actually got bipartisan support at the FTC that talked about the antitrust and the consumer protection authority we already have in this area. And I would draw your attention to the fact that just about 2 weeks ago, the Federal Trade Commission sued one of the wireless providers who had made a promise that you could get wireless broadband in an unlimited fashion and then limited it. And the FTC brought the case. If the president's net neutrality proposal gets adopted by the Federal Communications Commission, it would take the FTC's authority away from bringing that kind of case. And the FCC has had power for many, many years to bring such a case, and they haven't chosen to.
Right.
But the FTC has. And so my question is, how are you going to make consumers better off by actually taking away the consumer protection enforcer who's been on the beat to make sure companies meet their promises, including broadband carriers?
Yeah. And to go back to Carly's paradigm about big versus small, look, the major ISPs don't want net neutrality, but can they handle it if it happens? Yes, right? But what happens to that small ISP that's serving rural customers out in rural Texas, you know, through a wireless broadband system, and he has to comply with all these new regulations? He's the guy that goes out of business.
Well, and I think the other reality here is that, you know, bureaucracies have a certain nature to them, whether they're in business or in government. And a bureaucracy's nature is to move slowly, follow the rules, and don't innovate. That's how bureaucracies behave. It's not because the people in them are bad, it's because that's how they're geared to behave. So anytime you throw a bureaucratic regime on a fast-moving, innovative industry, you will slow that industry down. And there is no way, having dealt with the FCC for many, many years at AT&T, there is simply no way that any regulator can keep up with the pace of innovation in the 21st century. So you better limit how much authority they have to regulate that innovation.
We want to leave time for some good audience questions and Q&A. So I don't know if we have a wireless mic or not. We do. Okay. So raise your hand and wait for the mic so we can all hear you. We've got several up front, but I see we've got one in the back there.
Oh, you hold it? Okay.
So you might identify yourself, and then if you're targeting your question at a particular person, be sure to indicate that. Yes, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you all for being here. I'm Dennis McQuistion. I'm the interim CEO of the National Center for Policy Analysis. And help me with this. I think it was Charles Duell who said in about 1900, he was head of the patent office, that everything that should be invented has been invented, or can be invented has been invented. He was probably off by a few years. But there's an argument today, two arguments that I think are tied together. One, that has everything really important been invented? There's a big Wall Street Journal article, which you saw last month, talking about people on both sides. But secondly, the idea of patenting everything, every little bitty thing, so that nobody, especially small people, can understand what the patents are. Is there a connection between those two, and can you address those issues?
So, just to start, the only limitless resource we have in the world is human potential. And it is limitless. And why do I start there? Because it is ridiculous to assume that everything that's worth being invented has been invented. That is a lack of faith in human ingenuity and potential. It reminds me of, I'll digress for a moment, it reminds me of a television show I was watching the other day, you know, sort of half paying attention to it, and it was on the History Channel. It was this whole big theory that all the incredible innovations and accomplishments in ancient Egypt, the pyramids, and in ancient Mexico, all came about because aliens landed from out of space. I mean, these were serious scientists, and my reaction to that was, these are people who have no faith in the power of human ingenuity and the creativity of the human spirit. So we will be inventing forever, and thank goodness for that, unless we make it too hard.
Well,
unless we make it too hard. And the other thing that I would say is, yes, of course, any system can be abused. Any system can be abused. But I would offer this. The more complicated a system is, the more likely it is to be abused. Because the harder it is to have that abuse be transparent. If you have things that are simple and clear and transparent, less abuse is possible. It's why people say sunlight is always a disinfectant. So if you want to create abuse, put a really complicated process in place. And people will spend all their time trying to figure out the little places where they can abuse it.
it is an interesting rhetorical corner we can paint ourselves into if we say, you know, here's the, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, dead white men, what did they know about the internet? How could they possibly, we need to update the patent system of yesterday to deal with technologies that are new. It's a rhetorically powerful image, but there's this thing about patents. If it's not new, it's not patentable. So you could make the test for patentability turn on some subjective criterion, like I'm really into solar energy, so that's patentable today. Would you like a patent? I'll give you one. No, I'm sorry, you're into another, you're into wind energy. I love wind today. I'd like to get that. We're going to protect you. We could pick winners and losers. What's nice about an objective test for patentability like novelty is I'll show you my lab notebook, you show me yours. I got the goods or you got the goods. My date beats yours or it doesn't. And I could have 1,000 lawyers or just one, but my date is my date, and the goods in my lab notebook are the goods in my lab notebook. An objective system focused on an objective test like novelty is all about tomorrow. As Kettering used to say, everyone asked him, why is he so interested in the future? And he pointed out, that's where he hopes to spend the rest of his life.
One thing that always brings this issue home to me is my older sister is actually a computer science PhD. She got her PhD at Georgia Tech a number of years ago, and her field is supercomputing. And she told me many years ago, there's this thing called the internet. And we researchers use it with things called pages, where we are able to find out who else is doing research in our area. And what I said to her was, how interesting. And what I thought to myself was, doesn't sound very useful to me. So what that brings home to me is the idea that we have to engage as an enforcement agency, as a government regulator, with something I like to call regulatory humility. And that means we have to understand a very limited ability to predict the future. I'm not particularly good at that. I doubt very few people in the government are very good at it, maybe outside the science area. So what does that mean to somebody who is trying to figure out there are some abuses, there are some problems, how do we address those? So I always say we need to focus on what is a real harm. We know there's a real harm occurring in the market, and take the most direct path to fixing that harm. So if there are abusive patent letters out there, we need to stop those. But to say, with whether it's net neutrality or a very broader review of the patent system, I think we have to say, if there's not a real harm, if these are all very theoretical and we're not really seeing them occur in the market now, we need to be very cautious about adopting a fix to a problem that hasn't even developed yet, because we're often going to hurt something that we haven't even envisioned yet.
To just maybe tie together a couple of themes, Carly was pointing out how the wonderful faith well-founded faith we should have in American ingenuity and brains and in our brains. But we all also care about the rest of the world. And here's the funny thing about brain power. It's the only natural resource that happens to be uniformly distributed. Right. Wherever there are people. Some people happen to live on sand. Some people happen to live on gold or oil. But everybody lives with a brain. And intellectual property is the way to unlock the economic value that is in every wonderful human person all over the face of the planet. It's not only good for us, it's good for everybody. Tie another theme together. Net neutrality, the net, and the newness of these new technologies, and networked industries. I had the good fortune to serve as a law clerk to a famous judge, Giles Rich. He started his career in 1929. I worked for him when he was 92 years old. He was a wonderful man. He had horrible arthritis. His fingertips turned 90 degrees in the other direction. He was very wise. He knew a lot about the last 100 years of our economy because he lived it. And I remember as a young law clerk working for him, trained in economics and technology policy, all hyped up on the great things I could learn from this judge and maybe teach as well. And I just thought, boy, hey, boss, what about this new networked industry? What about the need to rethink everything? And he was very good as a teacher, which meant he taught without appearing to teach. And one day, with his crooked finger, he pointed to a book and said, Scott, could you get it for me? And I thought, gosh, he's 90 years old. I will surely get up and get the book for him. And he pointed to a lamp. He said, could you bring the lamp? Of course, I'll get the lamp. And he pointed to the plug and an outlet, and he asked if I would plug the outlet, the lamp into the outlet. I'm not going to ask the 92-year-old judge to get down on his hands and knees. And as I got down on my hands and knees and I started to plug the plug into the outlet, he asked me, how do you think that fits? That seems like a networked industry, isn't it? That was patent intensive, wasn't it? He had taught me everything I needed to learn that day. There are no new issues here. We have thought about these issues many times over with networked industries and standards industries, the early gasoline cracking patents, the early polyethylene patents, the polypropylene patents. Everybody saw the graduate plastics. That's where it is. That's the future. These are not new issues. And the solutions that were successful for us yesterday, property rights, they're going to be successful for us tomorrow.
Do we have time to take another couple questions? Let's see. We've got one right behind you there. Okay, I'm sorry. You've already got somebody here. Okay.
My question as a frustrated voter is, why are we not rolling up this issue and making it part of a platform? Because it's absolutely a critical part of getting things going again in this country. Nobody would argue that we're not where we should be.
Well, I think the stat that you just quoted is a great proof point of what I said earlier, which is this is a century of brain power. It's all about brain power. And the company with the best brain power wins. The country with the best brain power wins. Brain power, intellectual property is an engine of growth. And so a short answer to your suggestion is you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. If we want, as conservatives, to create a vibrant economy that produces more high-paying jobs, that unlocks the potential of as many Americans as possible, wherever they live and whatever their circumstances. Because one thing I know from other work I do, the point about brain power is uniformly distributed. Poor people have just as much human potential as successful people. What they don't have, necessarily, is opportunity and tools and training. So we need a platform that recognizes what it takes in the 21st century to enable as many people as possible to fulfill their potential. Because when that happens, everybody wins. And I think there are two core differences, in my mind, between, honestly, progressives and conservatives. One core difference is that as conservatives, we know that no one of us is any better than any other one of us. We know that everybody has potential. We know that everyone wants to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning, and that requires certain things, starting with, but not limited to, a job. But the other consequence of that is, I think we understand that some of us aren't smarter than others. I think progressives actually believe some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are better than others. Some of us are going to choose for others. Some of us are going to determine who wins and who loses for others, because not everybody's capable of that. It's a fundamentally different philosophy, and I think a lot of things flow from that. And the other core difference that I think is real and exists, and we need to be explicit about in our platforms for growth and unlocking the potential of this great nation once again, is to acknowledge that liberals and progressives tend to have a certain way of doing things, and their way of doing things is this: we have a problem here. Let's use that problem to create a sweeping solution whose outcome is more government bureaucracy, having more say over more of the economy. And we tend to say, no, we believe in the genius and the wisdom of everyday people. Let us have a targeted solution to a targeted problem if we can demonstrate that it's real and that the best solution comes from government. So that was a far too long answer, perhaps, to your point. But I think in the 21st century, unlocking people's potential is where it's all at, and that's about this.
There's an interesting angle on your question that is directly related to the concerns about patent reform, which is companies don't know how to show the value of all this intangible assets on their balance sheets. It's actually an interesting accounting problem. Well, as free marketers, we know how to determine the value of things, and it's markets, right? Markets is how these things are determined. So there have been several attempts to set up exchanges for patents and for intellectual property where they could literally be bought and sold on markets. Well, you wouldn't want to do something on the patent reform legislatively that would kill the ability of people to freely exchange and to market patents like a security or something like that. So, I mean, ultimately, that's how we start figuring out the value of some of these things, is by letting markets actually work. You wouldn't want to kill a nascent market through patent reform. It would be a good example of an unintended consequence. Let's try to get another question. You got one over here? And then we have a lady on the other side of the room who's been very patient, so let's try to get to her too.
Hi, I'm Stanley Feld, and I'm a retired endocrinologist, so it has nothing to do with patent reform. However, something that I've learned is that people have to have a prepared mind to be innovative, and you learn off the last guy. Now, sometimes if you have a blizzard of regulations and you're sitting there and you say, I have a good idea, it's the hula hoop. You don't know if somebody did a hula hoop before, and you get nailed. Now, I have to name drop and drop my son's name. It's Brad Feld. And I don't know if anybody in this room knows him, but he started the startup revolution. And he is teaching kids who are innovative out of college all over the country how to understand how to innovate and how to dodge the bullets of patterns. So one of the things that might be good that's not included in this discussion is eliminate all patterns and let people have prepared minds that innovate. And that, I'd like everybody to comment about that.
I've actually met your son. I've been on panels with him, and he's a very dynamic thinker. One thing that I would mention is that there's something called, open source software. There's the commons. If people want to take the fruits of their labor and share it with others freely, it is a free country, and certainly people are very, very welcome to do that. And I think, you know, there are some types of collaboration that work very well in that space. But I would say that history has shown that innovation has taken place more in countries where people can actually get property rights in their thoughts and ideas.
May I make another comment?
It's up to another.
We're long on time, so 30 seconds.
One thing. iTunes changed the publishing companies all over. The publishing companies fought to protect their vested interests.
And they had plenty of money. When this was all over and iTunes came out, the publishing companies ended up making more money on iTunes, selling one song at a time, than selling a CD with 16 songs. As a perfect example of innovation disintermediating an industry that was open source. And open source has been turned into a dirty word, but
So-
it really isn't.
So it's a great debate to have, and I notice we're losing our audience because we're over time here. But so let me just say one more thing, because I think it is a worthy debate. It is also true in the example that you just cited that we have loads and loads of individual artists who are now working hard to tell people why they should get paid for their work, and they are not being. So individual artists are suffering because that model, despite its many pluses, has also created a culture where people think, well, just because you wrote this wonderful song and took the risk and the time to publish it, why should you get anything out of that labor? I would argue that's anathema to the foundation of our economy and our nation. Just the last thing I would say, you said you're an endocrinologist, it has nothing to do with patents. Actually, it has everything to do with patents. It has everything to do with patents, because medicine does. As a cancer survivor, I am well aware that one of the drugs I took that saved my life was invented by an individual innovator who had to battle the system for 15+ years to get his intellectual property valued, and that turned into a medicine. So it is a worthy debate to have, but I don't think it's quite as black and white as your comments would suggest. That would just be my opinion.
And we have to stop there. Please join me in thanking our panelists for coming today.
Bravo.